Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that honestly I thought I had a pretty good grasp on, toleration. But this book we're diving into today, Toleration, a very short introduction by Andrew R. Murphy. Well, let me tell you, it really blew my mind, like completely flipped my assumptions about what toleration is and where it comes from.
Yeah, it's one of those things you think, oh yeah, toleration, pretty straightforward concept, right? Live and let live. But this book digs into the history of toleration, and it's just so much more complex and global than you might
I
expect.
know, right? Like I went in thinking, oh, this will be all about like Locke and Voltaire and the Enlightenment. But then, bam, the book starts talking about toleration before Locke, and suddenly we're back in ancient Persia with Cyrus the Great.
Yeah, the whole toleration before Locke thing, I thought that was a really clever way to frame it because it forces you to rethink this idea that toleration is purely a modern Western invention.
Totally. So Cyrus the Great, 6th century BC, what's the deal with him and toleration?
Well, Cyrus, this guy, he's conquering this massive empire, right? And he's got all these different groups, different religions, different cultures, all under his rule. And instead of trying to force everyone into one mold, he's like, you know what? You do your thing, you worship your gods, just don't cause any trouble.
So it's like toleration as a strategy for
Yeah,
keeping the peace in this giant empire.
exactly. And the book even talks about this ancient artifact called the Cyrus cylinder. It's like a declaration of religious freedom, but from 2,500 years ago. It lays out Cyrus's policy of allowing diverse religions to exist within his empire. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It's like, whoa, hold up. Toleration wasn't invented in the coffee houses of 18th century Europe. It's been around way longer than that.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Cyrus wasn't necessarily doing this out of some deep philosophical commitment to diversity. It was also a shrewd political move. By letting different groups practice their beliefs, he avoided a lot of potential unrest.
Okay, so toleration born out of practicality. That's interesting. And then the book jumps from Persia to India, right? We meet Emperor Ashoka in like the 3rd century BC, and he's also promoting religious harmony through these edicts he put out. It's like totally shatters that image I had of ancient rulers always trying to impose a single religion on everyone.
It really does challenge those assumptions, doesn't it? Ashoka was this Buddhist ruler, and he was deeply committed to nonviolence and respect for all living beings. And that extended to his policies on religious diversity. He was basically saying, hey, we can all live together peacefully, even if we have different beliefs.
So both Cyrus and Ashoka, these ancient rulers from totally different parts of the world, both figuring out that, hey, maybe letting people practice their own religions isn't such a bad idea for a stable society. It makes you realize that toleration, at least in some form, it's been this recurring theme throughout history. It's not just some like recent invention.
Absolutely. And the book kind of makes you see that, toleration, it's often driven by a mix of motives. Sometimes it is about principle, about valuing diversity for its own sake, but it can also be about power, about pragmatism, about maintaining order in a complex world.
Right. And it's not always about these like high-minded ideals. Sometimes it's just about keeping things running smoothly. Okay, so we've got ancient Persia, ancient India. Where does this historical tour of toleration take us next?
Well, buckle up because we're heading to medieval Spain. And get this, a period called the Convivencia.
Convivencia, what's that?
Basically, it was this period in medieval Spain where Muslims, Christians, and Jews were coexisting relatively peacefully. They were living in the same cities, interacting with each other, sometimes even collaborating.
Wait, seriously, like Muslims, Christians, and Jews all getting along in medieval Spain. That's like the opposite of what we usually hear about that period, right? All the crusades and religious wars and stuff.
Right. And the book doesn't shy away from acknowledging that the convivencia wasn't perfect. Power dynamics definitely existed, and things weren't always harmonious.
So we shouldn't romanticize it, right?
Exactly. But even with its flaws, the convivencia challenges this assumption that religious tolerance is purely a modern invention. It shows that different religious communities have found ways to coexist, at least for a time, throughout history.
It's like this little glimmer of hope in the midst of all the darkness we usually associate with that period. But it also raises some questions, right? Even in societies that appear tolerant on the surface, who really holds the power and whose voices are being marginalized?
That's such a crucial point, and the book really digs into that question. And to illustrate it, it takes us to another fascinating example, the Ottoman Empire's millet system.
The millet system. Okay, I gotta admit, I don't know much about that. Fill me in. What was going on in the Ottoman Empire?
So imagine this. You've got the Ottoman Empire, this vast, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. And they developed this system called the millet system, where different religious communities within the empire, they had a certain degree of self-governance.
Self-governance. So, like, they were kind of running their own show within the larger empire.
Exactly. They had their own religious courts. They could collect taxes within their own communities. They even had some control over education. It was a way of accommodating diversity, but within the framework of Ottoman rule.
Wow. So that's a totally different approach than, like, the Western model of individual rights that we're used to. It's like this alternative model of toleration that we don't often hear about.
It really is. And while it had its flaws, the millet system was a pretty pragmatic way to manage diversity in this sprawling empire. It shows that there have been different approaches to toleration throughout history, not just the one we're most familiar with.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient Persia to India to Spain and now to the Ottoman Empire. And we're still in, like, the pre-modern period. This book is really making me rethink my whole timeline of toleration.
And we're just getting started. The book then takes us to the Reformation. And you might think, oh, Reformation, religious conflict, that's the opposite of toleration, right? But even there, the book uncovers some really surprising nuances when it comes to this idea of toleration. You know, it's funny how even events that are known for, like, conflict and upheaval, like the Reformation, can end up having these unexpected impacts on an idea like toleration.
It's like you think you know the story, but then bam, this book throws in these curveballs that totally change your perspective.
Yeah, the Reformation, it wasn't really about toleration per se, but by challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, it kind of inadvertently cracked open the door for religious pluralism.
It's like once you start questioning one absolute truth, it becomes easier to consider other perspectives as well.
Exactly. And even Martin Luther, who you wouldn't exactly call a champion of toleration, his ideas actually ended up nudging things in that direction.
Wait, really? Luther? I thought he was all about, like, one true faith and all that.
He was definitely committed to his own version of Christianity, but he also believed that true faith couldn't be forced. It had to come from individual conscience.
So even though he wasn't advocating for, like, full-blown religious freedom, his ideas kind of planted a seed that later thinkers would pick up on.
Exactly. And the book takes us right into the heart of this debate on religious toleration that was raging in Europe in the centuries after the Reformation.
So like the 1600s and 1700s.
Yeah, that's when things really start heating up. And what's fascinating is that both sides of the argument, both the people arguing for toleration and those defending the old order, they were both using the Bible to support their positions.
Hold on, they were both using the Bible, like the same text, to argue for opposite viewpoints.
Absolutely. It's like they were reading two completely different books. They were interpreting passages in totally different ways to justify their views.
Wow, so the Bible became this battleground for this whole debate about the nature of truth and the limits of authority.
Exactly. And it shows that these ideas that we often think of as secular, like toleration, they were actually deeply intertwined with religious thought during this period.
It's like this reminder that history, it's never as simple as we think it is, right?
Totally. The book, it doesn't try to sugarcoat things or present this neat and tidy narrative. It shows how messy and complicated this history really is.
Yeah, it's about real people grappling with these huge questions in a world that was changing rapidly around them.
Right. It's not some abstract philosophical debate. It's about people's lives, their beliefs, their fears.
So even as these arguments for toleration were gaining traction, it wasn't all like sunshine and roses.
Definitely not. The book makes it clear that progress, it's not linear. It's not like this steady march towards enlightenment.
There were setbacks and blind spots and people who were left behind.
Exactly. And one of those blind spots that the book points out is anti-Catholicism. Even as some societies were becoming more open to religious diversity, anti-Catholic sentiment remained incredibly strong.
Wow. So even though things were moving in a more tolerant direction, there were still these deep-seated prejudices and fears that were holding things back.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that even when societies embrace toleration, there are often limits. There are groups who are excluded. There are fears that linger.
It's like toleration. It always comes with these asterisks, these caveats, these unspoken boundaries.
And those boundaries, they often reflect the power dynamics of the time, who's in control, who's on the margins, who's seen as the other.
And that theme of the limits of toleration, it continues as the book moves into the colonial era.
Right.
Because at that point, it's not just a European story anymore.
Exactly. European powers, they took their ideas about toleration with them as they expanded across the globe. But those ideas, they often got twisted and contorted in the process.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How did that play out? Give me some examples.
Well, take the Spanish Empire, for example. We often hear about the Black legend of Spanish cruelty, this image of them as these ruthless oppressors. But the book challenges that simplistic narrative. It shows that the reality was much more complex.
So it wasn't all black and white.
Not at all. Spanish authorities, they had this very complex relationship with religious minorities in their colonies.
Okay, so what was driving their policies? Was it just about, like, maintaining control?
Well, it was partly about that, for sure, but it was also driven by pragmatism, by a desire to keep the peace, by a recognition that they couldn't just force everyone to convert to Catholicism.
It seems like there's always this mix of motives, right? Like
Yeah.
power and pragmatism and sometimes maybe even a genuine desire for peaceful coexistence.
Absolutely. And the book dives into another fascinating case study, British India, the British East India Company. As they're trying to govern this vast and diverse land, they realized they needed to understand Hindu law.
Wait, they actually tried to make sense of Hinduism. Why?
Well, it was partly about practicality. They couldn't effectively rule a society they didn't understand, so they commissioned this text called the Code of Gentoo Laws.
The Code of Gentoo laws. What's that?
It was basically an attempt to translate and interpret Hindu legal traditions for a British audience. It was presented as a gesture of respect for local customs, a form of toleration.
So like, hey, we're cool with your religion. We're going to codify it for you.
Right. But of course, it was also a way of asserting their authority and making Indian society legible to British rulers.
So even in their attempts to be tolerant, they were still exerting their power. It makes you wonder if genuine toleration is even possible when there's such a power imbalance.
That's a question that runs through the entire book, and it's a question that becomes even more urgent as the book moves into the modern world, where the debate over toleration gets even more intense.
Wow, okay, so we've gone from ancient Persia to the British Empire. It's incredible to see how this idea of toleration, it keeps popping up in different forms throughout history.
And it's not just ancient history either. The book doesn't shy away from tackling the tough questions about what toleration means in the modern world, in a world that's more diverse and interconnected than ever.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, we hear the word toleration all the time these days, but what does it actually look like in practice? And is it even enough?
Right. That's a big question. And the book brings up this critique that toleration can sometimes be too passive,
Yeah.
just putting up with differences rather than actively engaging with them.
It's like that saying, right? I don't agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. But is that really enough? Or does true toleration require something more?
Yeah, that's the debate, isn't it? Like, is it enough to just live and let live? Or do we need to go beyond that? Do we need to actively seek understanding and dialogue across differences?
And how do you do that without erasing important distinctions, without pretending that all beliefs and values are equally valid?
Exactly. It's a tricky balance. And the book explores this idea that tolerance can sometimes mask deeper inequalities.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Like, you could have a society that appears tolerant on the surface, but where certain groups are still systematically disadvantaged.
Right. And so the question becomes, is toleration just about maintaining the status quo? Or can it be a force for positive change? Can it help us create a more just and equitable society?
It makes you realize that toleration, it's not some static thing. It's an ongoing process, a constant negotiation
Yeah.
of how we live together in a diverse world.
Yeah, and then there's this whole paradox of tolerance thing. That one really got me thinking.
Oh yeah, the paradox of tolerance. That's a mind bender.
Right. The idea is that if you're truly tolerant, you have to tolerate everything, even intolerance. But if you tolerate intolerance, doesn't it eventually destroy tolerance itself?
It's like this philosophical knot you can't quite untie.
Exactly. And it has real world implications too. Like, how do we deal with hate speech or extremism? Do we tolerate it in the name of free speech, or do we draw a line somewhere? And if so, where do we draw that line?
Where does toleration end and protecting society from harmful ideas begin? Those are tough questions.
And the book points out that defining intolerance, it's never neutral or objective. It's always a political act.
Right. So who gets to decide what's intolerant? Who gets to define the boundaries of acceptable speech or behavior?
Exactly. Those are questions that every society has to grapple with.
Okay.
And there are no easy answers.
Well, this whole conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I went into this deep dive thinking I knew a thing or two about toleration. But this book, it's really challenged my assumptions and opened up a whole new way of looking at things.
It's one of those books that stays with you. It
Yeah.
makes you question your own beliefs and assumptions. And it reminds you that toleration, it's not just some abstract concept. It's something we have to actively work towards every single day.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are as intrigued by this topic as we are, we highly recommend checking out the book that sparked this whole conversation, Toleration, a very short introduction by Andrew R. Murphy. It's a fascinating exploration of an idea that's shaped our world in profound ways, and it's more relevant than ever in today's complex and ever-changing world.
Couldn't agree more. It's a quick read, but it's packed with insights, and it'll definitely leave you with a lot to think about.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of toleration. And until next time, keep seeking knowledge and keep those critical thinking caps on.